journalists know that, journalists especially who interview rock musicians for a living, know that most of the time it is a case of spending an hour desperately hoping that the person on the other end of the microphone might say something remotely interesting that you can structure the feature around. A Tom Waits interview, you know you're going to come back with, 90 minutes full of stuff that you can use. He's very sharp, he's very lively, and he's very quick. And yeah, that obviously helps. And because people know that, television and print commissioning editors know that people know that Tom Waits is funny, therefore if he's on our program or if he's in our magazine, people are going to buy it. And also because he's Tom Waits, it makes everybody look kind of cool as well. So yeah, it certainly helped with his profile.
You travel with the Secret Service?
Well, I thought you hired them.
How do you know they were Secret Service or just
a lot of headgear they had? Well, it had a lot of big voltage type computer things coming out of their necks.
Coax hanging out of their suits, huh?
I thought it was maybe a hearing impaired group, but it turned out to be like a...
As a stage performer, he plays it for laughs. He utilizes it for laughs. And I'll always forgive. I mean, I love a cheap joke. I think half the good jokes in the world are cheap jokes. So some of his jokes are cheap. It doesn't mean they aren't funny. They're very funny. What does that mean? To me, it means a lot. I think somebody who can make you laugh for an hour or two, doing a lot for you. And he's very good at it, and I admire him for it.
When Waits returned to the studio to work on new material, Bones Howe interpreted his music in a way which would distinguish this particular batch of songs from the singer's previous output.
Tom, as usual, he gave me the demos, and he came with this group of lyrics, and we talked about what the feeling of the album would be. And I said to Tom, it's like a black and white movie. Maybe we should just make this like it's a black and white movie. And that was the theme of the record. The record is a black and white movie. It's that kind of a movie about those people who have chances for things and they never work out. And it's just one of those records that come about because Tom was in a particular place emotionally at that time.
Jack was in poker face with bullets back with bitches. Neil hunched at the wheel, putting everyone in stitches. Bragging about some nurses screwed while driving through Nebraska.
In Jack and Neil, you've perhaps got the ultimate expression of his beat fixation. And the wonderful thing about that is it's almost got every cliche you can imagine about the Beats, scoring Benzedrine and the nurse that he's shagging while he's driving at 100 miles an hour. And yet, somehow Waits takes all of these cliches and turns it into almost the ultimate statement about what the Beats were all about.
Foreign Affairs was another typically idiosyncratic album and was a marked departure from Small Change. It also featured his first duet with a notably high-profile female vocalist.
At that time he was dating Bette Midler, and he had this idea that he and Bette could do a duet together, and they wanted to do Baby It's Cold Outside. And I said, don't you think it would be more interesting if you wrote an original song for you two guys to do together? And he called me the next day and he said, I wrote this song about a guy and a girl sitting side by side at the bar. And the girl keeps going, well, I never talk to strangers. And I said, that sounds wonderful. So she sat right next to him at the piano, and we did that live. We actually recorded it live with the two of them sitting side by side at the piano, him playing and the two of them singing. Was done live with no intercutting, no overdubbing. That's it. And we made 4 or 5 takes, and that was it. That was the master. And for weeks, Bette Midler drove me crazy saying, I want to redo my vocal, I want to redo my vocal. And I kept saying, Bette, when we make records with Tom, we make the record and it's done. And that's the record. Tom likes it. I think we're finished. I think that's it.
Now tell me, do you really think I'd fall for that old line? I was not born just yesterday. Besides, I never talk to strangers in near way.
Baby, I ain't a bad guy. You get to know me. I thought there ain't no harm. I'll try my own business.
It is, in fact, the hardest thing to do, to write dialogue in a song. It's a quite different technique and a quite different skill from the conventional attributes of a singer-songwriter. And Waits just takes to it like a duck to water, because the language is just so natural. I mean, you almost feel that you're eavesdropping a conversation between two real people in a bar. I mean, there is a theatrical element to it as well, of course, because it's Tom Waits, so that's always going to be there. But the language itself is almost like, it could almost have been that he'd been in a bar one night, sitting on his own having a drink, and he heard this couple at the next table, and he thought, that sounds good, I'll make a note of that. It's that real.
I Never Talk to Strangers it's a very Tom Waits setup. It's him sort of struggling to remain upright on a bar stool and sort of slurring conversation at the woman on the bar stool next to him, who is in more or less the same state. And Bette Midler does a fine job. She camps it up wonderfully. But I mean, it's not a substantial piece of work, but it's funny and it's cute, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
The lush cinematic orchestration on the album not only firmly rooted it in a celluloid past, it allowed Waits to doff his cap to one of his key influences, the American composer George Gershwin.
You know, he doesn't like to pander to whatever the kind of conventional wisdom, is at any particular time. So if, people like Gershwin or, those kind of writers of the great American songbook, if everyone has contempt for them, thinks that Bob Dylan has just consigned all of them to the junk heap, well, Tom Waits is going to go precisely to that junk heap and find those characters and, revive them. But then, of course, he's not especially interested in the kind of, bright, triumphalist worldview that a lot of their music represents. So he then undermines that by the characters that he either sets or in whose mouth he puts those songs. He's escaping his own time, but also escaping the suppositions of the time that he's escaping to. So that it's complicated, so he's almost existing off the musical map at the same time as he's referencing all of these sites on the musical map.
The way he uses the strings on this record and the sort of cinematic feel is something quite different from what he'd done before. But in a way, I think it was entirely consistent because somebody said he was like a cross between Bogart's character in Casablanca and Jack Kerouac. So that sort of black and white 30s cinematic thing, I think, was always there, and he just amplified it on this record. But it was entirely consistent with what we'd come to know and love from him.
Despite its more cinematic direction, Foreign Affairs was a commercial disappointment after the respectable international sales of Small Change. As usual, Waits toured heavily to promote the album and returned to the studio in the summer of 1978 to work on the follow-up.
Blue Valentine started out because Tom got fascinated with second-line New Orleans music. And he had met a drummer in New Orleans named John Thomasy, who was a second-line drummer, really good player, lovely guy, lots of fun, and really good drummer. And he said, what if I got John Thomasy to come up and we made a second-line record, and I find a bass player that can play with him, and You know, it's just kind of evolved out of that. So Blue Valentine is kind of a blues record, but not really. You know, it would start kind of a New Orleans second line record, but not really. Everything kind of began from those things and grew into whatever it grew into to fit the tunes that he wrote.
Red shoes by the newsstand. The rain splashed a nickel and spilled like Chablis all along the midway. There's a little blue jay, a red dress, a sad night.
Blue Valentine, 1978, is clearly some kind of transitional album. I mean, we've had what I regard as a trilogy of records that are the peak of the boho, barstool philosopher. Now here, for a start, the instrumentation is different, and that must have been a very conscious decision to try and change the sound. So you've got Yamaha electric piano, you've got electric guitar. That immediately gives it something different. Although not quite immediately, because you start off with Somewhere from West Side Story, so that sort of tends to take you in, or you anticipate going in one direction. Then he comes straight in with Red Shoes by the Drugstore, which has this much harder edged beat to it. I mean, it's more rock inflected, less jazzy, and I think that was necessary at that point. I think he'd probably taken the sound he had as far as it could go. Although having said that, some of the best tracks on this album are those which are just Waits at the piano and Alcivar's string arrangements, like Kentucky Avenue.
I remember that Eddie Grace's Buick had 4 bullet holes in the side, and Charlie DeLisle was sitting at the top of an avocado tree.
Although new sounds were incorporated into what was a far more varied album, Blue Valentine still highlighted Waits' abilities in narrative songwriting.
It was very unusual to step into somebody else's shoes and be a storyteller in that way at the time. You know, the singer-songwriter was a very personal expression. And to begin a song like Christmas Card from a Hooker in Minneapolis with, you know, a line that says, "I'm pregnant." It's quite shocking in a way, you know, just that stepping out of your gender into somebody else's gender. It immediately makes you sit up and take notice what's going on here. And it was definitely very, very unusual and something that he used to good effect, and it allowed him to paint on a much broader emotional canvas.
Hey Charlie, baby, I'm pregnant, and I've been living on 9th Street here, right above this dirty bookstore off Euclid Avenue.
It just doesn't do it for me. I mean, Christmas Card from a Hooker in Minneapolis, I think is great. I mean, there's that great sort of twist in the tale that, I mean, you know, this long story she's telling is just complete fabrication, and you know, again, it's that sort of it's sort of wryly comic, but it's also immensely poignant, which he can do incredibly well. I just felt I think Small Change is the masterpiece. Foreign Affairs, I felt, was a sort of poor follow-up. Blue Valentine, after that, I just thought, no, he's taken his eye off the ball once too often here.
Despite critical approval, the album failed to reach a wide domestic audience, although Waits' star was on the rise internationally. Struggling to wrestle free from the constraints of the music that he had become famous for and briefly relocating to New York to find some inspiration, Waits was given an unexpected shot at a new direction by filmmaker Francis Ford Coppola. The director was looking to the singer-songwriter to both compose and perform tracks for his elaborate musical, One from the Heart.
He loved the experience of working on One from the Heart. It gave him a discipline. I mean, from dissolute to discipline. He went from that very rock and roll, on the road lifestyle, and he knew that, you know, it was doing him no good whatsoever.